When Richard's brown leather suitcases crossed the threshold of our home in Vermont, I didn't cry. The silence that settled in was the exact sound of 27 years of marriage evaporating into the crisp autumn air. At 50 years old, you expect to be discussing retirement plans or deciding where to take your next vacation, not staring at an empty bank statement while another woman's perfume still lingers in your husband's closet. He didn't leave me a classic note on the refrigerator. He left me an Excel spreadsheet detailing how our photography agency, the company we built together from nothing, now legally belonged only to him and his 26-year-old creative director. The worst part about being abandoned at 50 isn't the sudden loneliness. It's the look of pity from the neighbors when they realize his car no longer pulls into the driveway on Friday nights. Richard always said I was the foundation holding his life together. What he forgot to mention was that the moment that foundation looked old in his eyes, he decided to demolish the entire building without warning. I was holding a lukewarm cup of coffee when he said the words, "I deserve to be happy, Clara." As if the last 30 years I spent taking care of his health, his image, and his business had somehow stood in the way of his happiness. People say success is the best revenge. But when you're sitting on the floor of an empty kitchen in Burlington, newly 50 years old, holding an eviction notice in your hand, revenge feels like a very distant illusion. A corporate divorce is colder than an emotional one. When Richard asked for a separation, he wasn't just signing the end of our marriage. He was signing away my professional identity. 24 hours after Richard left, I discovered that the joint account where we had kept our future savings had been emptied 3 months earlier, quietly, methodically, and with surgical precision. He believed I would spend the rest of my life orbiting the pain of his abandonment, begging for scraps of attention or fighting for a fair settlement. What he forgot was that before I was Richard's wife, I knew exactly how to build an empire. He didn't leave me a note on the refrigerator. He left me an Excel spreadsheet explaining how the photography agency we had built together from the ground up now legally belonged to him and his 26-year-old creative director. Sometimes the end of an entire life doesn't arrive with shouting, slammed doors, or dramatic midnight confessions. Sometimes it arrives with the cold click of an email sent at 2 o'clock in the morning, containing an attachment that reduces 27 years of dedication, sleepless nights, and shared dreams to gray rows of financial data and a digital signature. When I looked at that screen, the clock hanging on the wall of my kitchen in Burlington read exactly 4 in the morning. The autumn silence of Vermont seemed to press against my temples. At 50 years old, society tells women they should be enjoying the rewards of stability, sitting on the porch of a home they own, looking back on a life built on solid ground. But sitting there in the blue glow of my computer monitor, illuminating the fine lines around my eyes, I realized the foundation beneath my feet had never been concrete. It was sand. And Richard had just pulled the rug out from under me with the precision of a surgeon. For the previous 2 decades, I had believed we were one machine working in perfect harmony. Richard was the public face of Vanguard Image, the charismatic photographer who charmed corporate clients from Boston to Montreal. I was the mind behind the contracts, the editor who spent countless nights perfecting every pixel, the strategist who transformed a garage studio into a respected brand. Yet in his spreadsheet, my name appeared beneath a single line item labeled Administrative Support Services. A position that seemed easily replaceable. An insignificant detail in the new chapter of life he planned to live. He assumed my silence in the face of that humiliation would be guaranteed by my fear of starting over. What he didn't know, and what I had forgotten beneath years of routine, was that the true talent behind a company doesn't live in the name signing corporate emails. It lives in the hands shaping light within the shadows. That morning, while my coffee grew cold in its mug, I made the first of many decisions that would change the course of my life. I would not respond to that email with desperation. I looked out the window and watched the first rays of sunlight touch the red and golden leaves outside. I knew the man I had shared a bed with for nearly 3 decades had left me in a desert. But even in the desert, there are seeds waiting beneath the surface, ready to break through the earth the moment the first storm passes. What I couldn't possibly know then was how large the secret Richard had left locked inside the safe of our former office truly was. Our story didn't begin in luxurious offices, or with contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It began in Montreal in the late 1990s, when we shared a tiny apartment with a heater that failed almost every January night. I was 23 years old and working at the university library. Richard was a young aspiring photographer with a second-hand film camera and an ambition that seemed too large for his chest. When we decided to start the agency, we sold nearly everything we owned to purchase our first professional lighting kit. I can still remember spending long nights cleaning film negatives on our kitchen table while Richard sketched logo ideas on paper napkins. We were a team in every possible sense of the word. As the years passed, we moved to Burlington in search of a quieter life, but the business only continued to grow. Vanguard Image became one of New England's most respected names in luxury corporate photography and architectural editorial work. Our daily lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. Every morning began the same way. Richard made the coffee while I reviewed the production schedule for the week. We owned a beautiful brick house near the lake, 2 cars in the garage, and hosted regular dinners with friends every Friday evening. To anyone watching us walk down Main Street, we looked like the textbook definition of an unbreakable marriage, shaped by time and strengthened by shared success. I was proud of that stability. I devoted every minute of my 30s and 40s to making sure Richard had complete creative freedom. While he traveled to capture winter landscapes or photograph CEOs in Manhattan, I managed cash flow, dealt with lawyers, organized taxes, and ensured the business machinery never missed a beat. I believed that division of responsibilities was our superpower. I felt secure in my behind-the-scenes role, convinced that love and business partnership were simply 2 sides of the same precious coin. The problem with comfort is that it often works like anesthesia. When life becomes too stable, you stop paying attention to small changes in direction. You ignore the fact that business dinners begin running later into the evening. You overlook minor inconsistencies in financial reports because the other person dismisses them as accounting errors. I trusted Richard completely. If he told me a particular campaign had failed to make a profit, I accepted it and worked twice as hard the following month to compensate. I believed our future was secured by decades of shared effort. What I didn't realize was that the structure supporting our life together had already begun to rot from the inside, like a wooden beam slowly being eaten away by termites in total silence. The first cracks appeared subtly, almost invisibly. It was early in 2025 when Richard suggested a legal restructuring of the agency. He explained that for tax purposes and to attract new Canadian investors, it would be safer to consolidate ownership under a new holding company registered solely in his name. I remember him sitting at the office conference table with that familiar expression of professional concern that had always reassured me. He told me the change would protect our personal assets if the economy entered a recession. I signed the transfer documents without reading the fine print. Why would I question the man who held my hand at the hospital when my mother died? Why would I doubt the man who celebrated every business victory beside me? Not long afterward, Chloe was hired. She was 26 years old, energetic, digitally savvy, and carried a portfolio filled with modern social media concepts. Richard insisted the agency needed a visual refresh if it wanted to stay competitive with younger firms. At first, I thought hiring her was an excellent decision. I personally introduced her to many of our longest-standing clients and encouraged her to bring fresh ideas into the company. But gradually, the atmosphere in the office began to change. Planning meetings that once involved the entire team started taking place behind closed doors between Richard and Chloe. I began noticing small behavioral patterns that made me uncomfortable, though I constantly tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Richard started changing the way he dressed. The traditional wool jackets he had worn for years were replaced by expensive designer pieces Chloe recommended. His phone, which had once been left casually on the living room table, suddenly required a password, and was always placed face down. Whenever I asked about specific projects, he responded vaguely, using trendy marketing language that clearly wasn't his own. "You're too focused on the past, Clara. The market has changed. We need to be more dynamic." He said it one evening with a tone of superiority I had never heard from him before. The emotional distance was the most painful part of that transition. One by one, our Friday dinners were cancelled because of supposed production emergencies involving clients in Montreal. In our bedroom, silence became an unwelcome third presence. Richard always lay with his back toward me, absorbed in his phone, answering messages he claimed were from international suppliers. I would stare at the ceiling for hours, feeling a strange coldness settle in my stomach. A persistent instinct told me that the man beside me was becoming a complete stranger. The moment my discomfort turned into genuine concern came, when I noticed a significant transfer of money from our savings account into the company's operating account. The transaction had been made without my usual approval. The next morning, when I attempted to access the financial system to investigate, I discovered my administrator credentials had been revoked. The final confrontation contained none of the drama people expect from the end of a marriage. There were no tears. No shouting. No dramatic accusations. Only the cold efficiency of a business transaction. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, when I asked Richard to sit down with me in the conference room and explain why my system access had been blocked. He entered carrying a black leather portfolio. But he wasn't alone. Instead of Chloe, he was accompanied by a divorce attorney whose name I recognized only from advertisements in local business magazines. The sight of them together made my heart skip a beat. Richard never looked me in the eye. He kept his attention fixed on the papers spread across the polished mahogany table while the lawyer began speaking in a rehearsed, emotionless voice. They presented me with a proposal for the dissolution of our marriage and a termination agreement for my services within the company. Because of the restructuring documents I had signed months earlier without reading carefully, Vanguard Image now belonged entirely and legally to Richard. The lawyer explained, with an almost insulting level of politeness, that I would receive a minimal financial settlement distributed over 24 monthly payments. In exchange, I would be required to sign a non-compete agreement preventing me from working in photography or visual production within a 100-kilometer radius for the next 3 years. Richard finally broke his silence. I want this to be amicable, Clara. We both know the agency needs an energy that you can no longer provide. I've moved on, both personally and professionally. The revelation that he and Chloe had been involved for nearly a year didn't come from him. It came later that night, when I accidentally saw a photograph on the private social media account of one of our studio assistants. They had been planning the transition for months. Richard had emptied our household reserve fund to finance a luxury apartment in downtown Montreal, where he intended to live with her. He had used my work behind the scenes to pave the road for his own escape. And now he was leaving me at 50 years old without the company I helped build, without my marriage, and trapped inside a legal agreement designed to destroy my ability to earn a living. The ground disappeared beneath me. The betrayal wasn't simply about the end of the marriage. It was about the systematic erasure of my professional existence. Richard knew exactly who kept that company running. He knew every major corporate client had signed because of my organization, my consistency, and the flawless execution I delivered behind the scenes. Yet he chose to discard me as if I were outdated equipment. A business expense that needed to be eliminated so he could feel young again beside someone new. He walked out of that room carrying his black portfolio, and leaving behind the blueprint of a destroyed life. And he was convinced I would accept defeat in silence simply because of my age. The days that followed Richard's departure were marked by the complete collapse of my routine. The house in Burlington, once a warm and comforting refuge, became a mausoleum filled with painful memories. Every corner carried his presence. The art books on the shelves. The leather chair where he used to drink his morning coffee. Even the scent of his cologne seemed permanently woven into the curtains. I would spend hours sitting on the sofa, watching sunlight slowly crawl across the floor until darkness swallowed the room. Some evenings, I didn't even have the energy to turn on the lights. The feeling of helplessness was paralyzing. My closest friends, the same people who had shared our Friday dinners for years, began drifting away. Divorce, especially when it involves public betrayal and a business dispute, creates an uncomfortable force field around the person left behind. People don't know what to say. They're afraid of taking sides. Or worse, they prefer to remain close to whoever still holds power, money, and social prestige. I received brief text messages offering hollow sympathy, but the invitations stopped coming. The lunches disappeared. The phone calls became less frequent. One by one, the relationships I believed were genuine quietly evaporated. I found myself completely isolated, trapped inside the deafening silence of a network that vanished the moment my social status changed. My physical health soon began reflecting the emotional damage. I couldn't sleep more than 2 hours a night. I would wake up with my heart racing, replaying conversations, reviewing documents, searching for warning signs I had missed. I lost weight rapidly because food tasted like ash. Looking at myself in the bathroom mirror became an act of self-punishment. I saw a 50-year-old woman with deep circles beneath her eyes, pale skin, and a defeated expression I never imagined I would recognize as my own. I felt invisible. A cliché. Just another middle-aged woman who had been replaced and discarded. The final blow arrived in the form of a legal notice. The Burlington house was being placed on the market as part of the asset division Richard had already set into motion. According to the court documents, I had 30 days to vacate the property. Watching real estate agents walk through the rooms with prospective buyers was almost unbearable. They pointed at walls I had painted myself. They discussed square footage and market value while standing inside the ruins of my life. That was the moment something inside me cracked. The shame was overwhelming. I wanted to disappear before anyone could witness how far I had fallen. I was about to lose the last piece of solid ground I had left. The lowest point of my journey came on a cold Tuesday in November. Freezing rain hammered against the windows, announcing the arrival of another harsh Vermont winter. Cardboard boxes surrounded me in the middle of an empty living room. The moving truck I had hired with the little money remaining in my personal account had already transported my belongings to a small basement apartment in an industrial area of Burlington. I sat alone on the bare wooden floor. The house echoed with every movement. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to cry. Not quietly. Not with dignity. I collapsed into deep, uncontrollable sobs. It was the cry of total humiliation. The cry of someone who had lost everything she thought defined her. That night, inside the basement apartment, reality arrived without mercy. The space was damp. The windows were small and positioned at street level. The constant sound of trucks passing outside echoed through the walls. I looked at my bank balance on my phone. The number was almost laughable. It would barely cover 3 months of rent and basic living expenses if I didn't find a way to generate income immediately. The non-compete clause Richard's lawyers had forced upon me felt like a rope tightening around my neck. I couldn't start another photography agency in the region without risking a lawsuit that would destroy me financially. I picked up my old camera. A vintage Nikon that Richard had never included in the company inventory because he considered it a collector's item with no real commercial value. Holding it against my chest, I felt something unfamiliar. Not sadness. Not fear. Anger. A deep and painful anger. How did I let this happen to me? The words escaped my mouth and echoed through the empty apartment. I had devoted the most productive years of my life to someone else's dream. Now, in what was supposed to be the second half of my life, I had no recognized career, no clear purpose, and no confidence that I could compete against a generation of younger professionals charging a fraction of the price for quick social media content. The feeling of uselessness became physical. A weight pressing against my chest. The next day, I stayed in bed from morning until night. The blankets covered my head while I wished time would stop moving. Part of me wanted to believe this was all a complicated nightmare. I was standing at the edge of surrender. I was ready to sign Richard's settlement agreement and accept the humiliating monthly payments he offered as an act of charity. The silence of that basement apartment seemed to confirm his diagnosis of me. A woman from the past. A woman with no place in the fast-moving digital world he now occupied with Chloe. But life has a strange habit of hiding its greatest turning points inside the moments when we have completely run out of strength. The change began with an unexpected phone call on a gray Thursday morning. The voice on the other end belonged to Evelyn Vance. She was 72 years old and owned Vance Heritage Textiles, one of the oldest and most respected textile mills in the region near the Canadian border. The company was in serious trouble. Cheap imports were stealing contracts. Revenue was shrinking. And the factory desperately needed a complete brand repositioning if it hoped to survive in the premium interior design markets of Boston and Toronto. Evelyn had been a client of our agency years earlier. She had always respected the way I handled business. "Clara, I know what happened between you and Richard." Her voice carried the directness of someone who had spent decades leading people through difficult situations. "But I don't care about divorce gossip." I sat silently, unsure how to respond. She continued. "I know who actually built the strategy behind that agency. Whenever I needed real results, you were the person I spoke to." There was a pause. "My factory is dying. 40 families depend on those jobs. I need someone who understands storytelling, branding, and operational structure. Are you available?" The offer felt like a life preserver thrown into the middle of an ocean. But it came with a challenge. The factory couldn't afford traditional agency fees. Evelyn offered a modest salary along with a significant share of future profits if the turnaround succeeded. What made the proposal even more remarkable was that it fit perfectly through a legal loophole Richard's lawyers had failed to anticipate. The non-compete agreement prevented me from opening a competing photography agency. It did not prevent me from working as an internal director of marketing and strategy for a textile manufacturer. It was a gray area. A narrow opening. A chance. Yet fear remained. I had never led the complete marketing operation of a traditional industrial company entirely on my own. For years, my work had existed behind Richard's public image. Now there would be nowhere to hide. The following morning, I visited the factory. The scene was almost heartbreaking. Old mechanical looms moved slowly across vast production floors. The buildings were aging. The lighting was poor. Many of the workers were close to retirement age. They looked at me with a mixture of hope and skepticism. But when I ran my fingers across the pure wool fabrics, something inside me awakened. The patterns carried stories. Stories of immigration. Stories of craftsmanship. Stories of resilience. For the first time in months, I felt a spark. A genuine spark. There was a raw authenticity inside the factory that no trendy social media campaign could imitate. Richard and Chloe were chasing aesthetics. This place possessed soul. And soul was something the market still valued, even if it had forgotten how to recognize it. In that moment, standing among aging looms and generations of accumulated craftsmanship, I made my decision. I accepted the challenge. I had no idea then that walking into that factory would become the first step toward rebuilding not only my career, but my entire identity. My first official day at Vance Heritage Textiles was spent doing what I had always done best, building structure where chaos had taken root. The factory's communication systems were outdated. Its archives were neglected. Its story had been forgotten. As I began examining decades of company records, I discovered something extraordinary. Stored away in dusty boxes in the attic above the administrative offices were rare photographs from the factory's earliest years, handwritten letters from loyal clients, and fabric samples dating back nearly a century. Most people would have seen old documents. I saw buried treasure. The true value of the company wasn't hidden inside its accounting reports. It lived in its history. Its endurance. Its identity. Every afternoon, I carefully cleaned those archives and digitized every image using the modest equipment I had available. The work felt strangely therapeutic. For the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about Richard. I wasn't replaying old conversations. I wasn't wondering where things had gone wrong. I was building something. Instead of hiring expensive photographers the company couldn't afford, I decided to handle the visual production myself. But this time, I approached it differently. I wasn't interested in creating flawless, highly polished advertising. I wanted authenticity. I focused my lens on the details most people overlooked. The weathered hands of veteran weavers. The rhythmic movement of century-old wooden looms. The texture of natural wool illuminated by sunlight filtering through dusty skylights. There was beauty there. Not manufactured beauty. Not the artificial perfection that dominated social media feeds. Real beauty. The kind that comes from time, effort, and human resilience. When the first phase of our campaign launched, we called it the thread of time. The concept was simple. Tell the stories of the people behind the fabric. Show the connection between craftsmanship and character. Reveal the human beings responsible for creating products built to last. The written content carried a personal and reflective tone. It was the complete opposite of the loud, aggressive marketing that had become common across the industry. To Evelyn's surprise, and honestly to mine as well, the response was immediate. Interior designers from Montreal began sharing our posts. Architects in Toronto commented on the authenticity of the campaign. Industry publications reached out requesting interviews. People weren't responding to our products. They were responding to our story. 3 weeks after launching the campaign, the first major breakthrough arrived. A high-end architecture firm in Toronto contacted us. They were designing a luxury boutique hotel and wanted a custom upholstery collection created exclusively by Vance Heritage Textiles. The value of that single contract equaled nearly 6 months of the factory's previous revenue. I stared at the email confirmation for several minutes. Then I read it again. And again. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I needed proof that it was real. Sitting alone in my basement apartment that evening, I finally realized something important. My abilities had never belonged to Richard. My strategic thinking wasn't dependent on his name. My value wasn't tied to his success. The skills that built Vanguard Image were still mine. Nobody could take them away through legal paperwork. Nobody could erase them with a divorce agreement. For the first time since my marriage ended, I felt hope. Real hope. Not survival. Possibility. But success has a way of attracting attention. Especially from people who expected you to fail. One Wednesday afternoon, a registered legal notice arrived. It was sent by the lawyers representing Vanguard Image. Richard had apparently noticed that my name was beginning to circulate within the same professional design circles where his agency operated. The notice accused me of violating the non-compete agreement. According to their argument, my involvement in creating visual materials for the textile factory constituted direct competition. They demanded that I immediately cease all marketing and photographic activities. Failure to comply, they warned, would result in severe daily financial penalties. For a brief moment, fear returned. Not because I believed they were right. Because I knew how exhausting legal battles could become. When Evelyn saw the notice sitting on my desk, she remained remarkably calm. Decades of running a manufacturing company had taught her something I was still learning. Panic rarely solves anything. She handed the documents to the factory's senior legal advisor, a veteran commercial lawyer who specialized in employment and contract law. Together, we spent an entire evening reviewing every page of the agreement Richard had forced me to sign. When the lawyer finally finished reading, he smiled. It was the first smile I had seen all night. "Clara," he said, "Richard doesn't have a case." I stared at him. He continued. "You're employed as the director of marketing and strategy for a textile manufacturer. You're not operating a competing photography business. The visual content you're producing is internal and directly connected to your role within the company." He tapped the document with his finger. "He's trying to intimidate you. The realization hit me immediately. Richard wasn't acting from a position of strength. He was acting from insecurity. The campaign was working. People were paying attention. And somewhere deep down, he knew exactly who had been responsible for much of the strategic success of Vanguard Image. As the months passed, additional information began reaching me through industry contacts. Former clients were growing frustrated with the agency. The work looked visually appealing, but deadlines were being missed. Project management was inconsistent. Large corporate accounts complained about communication failures. The same systems I had quietly maintained for years were beginning to collapse in my absence. Richard and Chloe excelled at presentation. But presentation without structure eventually falls apart. Instead of retreating, we decided to move forward aggressively. The legal notice was answered with a formal response supported by employment contracts, operational records, and documentation proving that my work was entirely internal to Vance Heritage Textiles. Then we accelerated our efforts. A documentary film was produced for the company website. Narrated by Evelyn herself, it showcased the real people and real craftsmanship behind the factory's products. I devoted every available hour to that project. Every frame mattered. Every interview mattered. Every story mattered. I wanted the finished piece to communicate something undeniable. Substance. Integrity. Permanence. The documentary exceeded every expectation. Industry organizations shared it. Design magazines featured it. New inquiries arrived almost weekly. The factory was no longer fighting for survival. It was becoming a respected brand once again. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. Vance Heritage Textiles was selected as the lead supplier for the restoration of a historic government building complex in Ottawa. The project required extraordinary technical precision. 19th-century textile patterns had to be reproduced exactly. Every stage of production needed to be documented for Canada's National Heritage Archives. The contract was prestigious, competitive, and highly visible. I personally led the presentation before the selection committee. For hours, I explained how our combination of historical authenticity, operational excellence, and visual storytelling created a stronger proposal than those submitted by much larger competitors. When the decision was announced, we won. The financial impact was transformative. The government contract allowed the factory to expand production, modernize equipment, and secure its future. True to her word, Evelyn restructured my agreement. I was no longer simply an employee. I became a minority partner in the company, holding a 30% share in the premium design division. For the first time since losing everything, I wasn't rebuilding. I was growing. I left the basement apartment behind. In its place, I rented a small cottage overlooking Lake Champlain. The home was simple. Wood, glass, sunlight, and open water. Nothing extravagant. Yet it felt more luxurious than the mansion I had once shared with Richard. Because this life belonged entirely to me. Every decision, every success, every step forward. As I stood by the windows overlooking the lake that first evening, watching sunlight dance across the water, I realized something profound. Richard hadn't ended my life. He had accidentally returned it to me. The transformation wasn't only professional. It was personal. Deeply personal. At 51 years old, I discovered something I had never fully understood during my marriage. Freedom isn't the absence of responsibility. It's the ability to make decisions without asking for permission. For decades, I had measured my value through my usefulness to other people. As Richard's wife. As the person holding the business together behind the scenes. As the one who solved problems before anyone else even noticed they existed. Now, for the first time in years, I was forced to look at myself without any of those labels. And what I found surprised me. I wasn't broken. I wasn't outdated. I wasn't invisible. I was experienced. Capable. Resilient. The lines on my face no longer looked like evidence of decline. They looked like proof of survival. Each one represented a lesson learned, a challenge overcome, a responsibility carried. The years I had once feared became a source of confidence. Not because aging had made life easier, but because it had taught me who I really was. My professional network slowly rebuilt itself. This time, however, it was different. People weren't connecting with me because I was Richard's wife, or because I represented Vanguard Image. They were connecting with me because of my work. Architects, designers, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders began reaching out directly. The reputation I had spent decades helping others build was finally becoming my own. One of the initiatives I became most proud of was a mentorship program we created inside the factory. Young women from the local community were invited to learn branding, business strategy, visual storytelling, and authentic content creation. Many of them arrived believing they had little to offer. They reminded me of myself years earlier. Talented, intelligent, yet often underestimated. Watching them grow became one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I taught them something I had learned the hard way. Technology changes. Markets change. Trends change. But authenticity never loses value. A camera can capture an image. Only a person can capture meaning. The more I invested in helping others develop their confidence, the more my own sense of purpose strengthened. I was no longer the woman fixing someone else's mistakes in the shadows. I was building something lasting. Something that belonged to me. The most meaningful moment of my new life arrived quietly during the autumn of 2026. Vance Heritage Textiles had been invited to the annual New England Interior Design Gala in Boston. The company was receiving an award for excellence in heritage preservation and textile innovation. It was one of the most respected events in the industry. That evening, I wore a perfectly tailored suit made from one of our own premium wool fabrics. As I stood in front of the hotel mirror before leaving my room, I felt something that had been absent for years. Peace. Not excitement. Not anxiety. Peace. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are. The ballroom was filled with designers, architects, executives, and media representatives from across North America. As I walked through the lobby before the ceremony, I saw them. Richard and Chloe, standing only a few meters away. For a moment, time seemed to pause. 2 years earlier, seeing them together would have shattered me. Now it felt strangely ordinary. They looked different. Not older. Just heavier. The weight of constant pressure seemed visible in Richard's face. The confidence he once projected so effortlessly appeared strained. Through industry contacts, I had already heard rumors. Vanguard Image had recently lost 2 of its largest corporate accounts. Clients complained about inconsistent project management, missed deadlines, and unreliable reporting. The exact responsibilities Richard had once dismissed as administrative support services. The exact responsibilities I had quietly managed for years. Richard noticed me. For a brief second, our eyes met. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. Then hesitation. Then discomfort. Without saying a word, he turned and walked toward the hotel bar. Avoiding eye contact. Avoiding conversation. Avoiding me. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I felt no anger. No desire for revenge. No need to prove anything. The fantasy of revenge disappears when you become too busy building a life you genuinely enjoy. Standing there, watching him walk away, I realized something important. The man I had mourned wasn't standing in front of me. That version existed only in my memories. The real Richard was simply a human being who had made choices. Some good. Some terrible. And none of those choices had the power to define my future anymore. When the ceremony began, Evelyn and I were invited onto the stage. The applause filled the room. As the presenter announced my name and described my role in the company's transformation, I looked out across the audience. For a moment, I thought about everything that had happened. The empty house. The basement apartment. The sleepless nights. The humiliation. The fear. The uncertainty. Every painful step that had brought me to this moment. The award itself wasn't what mattered. What mattered was what it represented. Proof. Proof that rebuilding was possible. Proof that losing everything doesn't mean losing yourself. Proof that a person's value cannot be erased by betrayal. As I accepted the award, I felt an unexpected lightness. Richard believed he was leaving me with nothing when he took the agency and the house in Burlington. What he never understood was that he also removed something else. The burden of maintaining a life that no longer belonged to me. The burden of protecting an illusion. The burden of carrying a relationship built on appearances rather than truth. My greatest victory wasn't seeing his decline. It was discovering that I no longer needed his approval to recognize my own worth. Today, when I stand by the window of my cottage overlooking the calm waters of Lake Champlain, I understand something I once could never have imagined. Starting over at 50 isn't a punishment. It's a privilege. A rare opportunity to rebuild your life with complete honesty. When my marriage ended in such a cold and calculated way, I believed my story was over. I thought every chapter ahead would simply be a sad repetition of what had already been lost. I was wrong. The pain of betrayal is real. Financial collapse is frightening. Social isolation can feel unbearable. But those experiences also act as powerful filters. They remove everything artificial. They reveal who truly belongs in your life. And most importantly, they force you to rediscover strengths you forgot you possessed. That tiny basement apartment taught me how to hear my own voice again. It taught me to trust my instincts. It reminded me that 30 years of knowledge and experience cannot be erased by a signature on a legal document. So if you're listening to this story while standing among moving boxes after an unexpected divorce, if you're looking at a job market that seems too young, too fast, and too exclusive for someone your age, remember this. Never allow someone who discarded your value to become the author of your story. Maturity is not a disadvantage. It is an asset. A quality seal earned through experience. A foundation that allows you to rebuild stronger after every storm. The end of the life you planned is often the beginning of the life you truly deserve. Clara's journey reminds us that the greatest danger in a long relationship isn't losing love. It's gradually forgetting our own independent worth. Many of us spend years building stages for other people to shine upon. We convince ourselves that partnership alone will protect us from uncertainty. Then one day, life forces us to stand in front of a mirror without the titles. Without the labels. Without the roles we've hidden behind. Starting over after 50 requires letting go of an identity that no longer serves us. It requires transforming grief into purpose. Pain into strength. Loss into freedom. True victory isn't found in the sound of someone else's defeat. It's found in the quiet realization that the keys to our success were in our own hands all along. What would you do if you discovered that the person you trusted most had spent months planning to take away the business you built together? If stories of resilience, reinvention, and women discovering their true strength after 40 inspire you, subscribe to the channel and become part of our community. In the next episode of her second chapter, a respected Boston architect uncovers a secret offshore account that exposes the shocking truth about the men she spent 25 years loving. Sometimes being left behind by someone who never truly valued you is the push destiny gives you to stop carrying the weight of other people's dreams and finally begin building your own kingdom.